The only person at this stage is a convicted felon is the man I'm looking at right now.
But when he talks about a convicted felon, his son is a convicted felon.
This guy's 3 years younger and a lot less competent. I think that just look at the record. Look at what I've done.
Well, I took 2 tests, cognitive tests. I aced them, both of them, as you know. We made it public. He took none. I'd like to see him take one, just one, a real easy one. Like 51 intelligence agents said that the laptop was Russia disinformation. It wasn't. That came from his son, Hunter. It wasn't Russia disinformation. He made up the suckers and losers, so he should apologize to me right now.
My son was not a loser. He was not a sucker. You're the sucker. You're the loser.
Last night's debate left Democrats reeling after President Biden's shaky performance during his 90 minutes on stage. All eyes were on the president, with his campaign hoping he could have a repeat performance of his State of the Union address earlier this year. But on Thursday, Biden appeared to struggle to form coherent sentences and at times even froze mid-sentence.
Making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with, look.
Trump was able to seize on Biden's energy, hitting back at his stumbles and making a number of false claims. Now Democrats are scrambling to shift last night's narrative, and even some are renewing speculation that it could be time to replace Biden as the Democratic nominee. But the Biden campaign is adamant that the president will not drop out. Joining me now is my colleague, the Hill's congressional reporter, Mychael Schnell, who covered last night's debate with me. Mychael, I hope you got some rest. I know we're back to work today after a very late night, but one thing I'm sure you're noticing on Capitol Hill, I'm noticing it with my campaign sources, Democrats are in full panic mode, or they appear to be in full panic mode, over Biden's performance after the president wasn't able to hammer Trump on a number of issues, including the January 6th attack on the Capitol and the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Mychael, you're in the Capitol. What are Democratic lawmakers saying overall about the president's performance on stage and some of those blunders?
Yeah, I've heard from a lot of House Democrats today, Julia, that last night just wasn't President Biden's best night. And that is coming from a wide array of House Democrats, essentially saying that, they like Joe Biden, they respect Joe Biden, but that was not his best performance last night. That came from the likes of former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, other more rank and file members. But most of them aren't wanting to talk. Actually, nobody is wanting to talk on the record about whether or not President Biden should be replaced at the top of the ticket. Some of them, though, when you bring the conversation on background and allow them to have that shield of anonymity to be able to talk about these sensitive topics, I have heard from some House Democrats who think it is time for President Biden to step down from the top of the ticket and to give it to a different Democrat who is better able to articulate the party's goals and priorities and agenda ahead of November. Now, whether or not that ends up happening remains to be seen. Of course, the Biden campaign, as you mentioned, being very clear that it has no plans of having President Biden step down from the top of the ticket. But there is plenty of chatter around Democratic circles right now, Julia, about the prospect of not being the nominee come November.
You know, it's remarkable that the idea of a contested convention in Chicago in August is even being brought up. We know that Democrats have brushed that off, but we've seen Democrats even publicly just float this idea. So that's, a major development. There's obviously renewed calls for Democrats to replace Biden on the presidential ticket. Note that he's not officially the party's nominee. He needs to be nominated for that first. But how is the Biden campaign fighting to shut down these talks? At the time of this taping today, Biden is in North Carolina. He seems much more energetic than he was last night. Do you think that's going to be enough to move the needle?
I mean, it could help. Look, if he came out and had a blunder tonight, again, in a poor public appearance today, again, that definitely wouldn't be a good look. So the Biden campaign is hoping to get anything it can to sort of back up this narrative that President Biden is fit and is up to being president of the United States for another 4 years. But essentially, the Biden campaign really trying to tamp down on these arguments, these claims, these suggestions that the president should step down from the top of the ticket, just flat out saying, no, he's not dropping out. That's what the Hill heard from one Biden campaign spokesperson today. So we'll have to keep an eye on that, continue to watch that rhetoric, especially as we see some more post-debate polls come in and see if there's a shift in support for the president after last night's appearance. But nonetheless, Biden back on the campaign trail today, as you mentioned, rallying voters, and the Biden campaign saying the president is not going anywhere.
Mychael, one person with a very unique perspective on this debate is CNN anchor and former debate moderator Chris Wallace. He, of course, moderated that very first infamous debate in 2020 where Biden and Trump were seen really shouting over each other, and it got a little out of control. But Chris Wallace said last night on CNN that he wasn't impressed with Biden's performance, claiming the president wasn't capable of doing any better. Mychael, is Wallace right?
I mean, it's such a subjective take right there that I don't know if there's a right or wrong. But look, going into this, and it's something that we spoke about yesterday, the bar was pretty low for President Biden, right? A lot of folks had said that they wanted him to go out there and be aggressive. They wanted to sort of see the State of the Union Joe Biden, the one that was very animated and had a lot of energy, and gotten those back and forths with Republican lawmakers during the State of the Union address in the House chamber. That was just not what we saw last night. And a lot of folks afterwards, the commentary had said that the bar was so low for Biden that all he had to do was come on, put a few sentences together, and contrast former President Trump's vision for America and his record during his 4 years in office. And Democrats are now saying that he couldn't achieve that. So it's definitely a concern among some. But in terms of Chris Wallace's take, I mean, I'll leave that to him in terms of if it's right or wrong.
Yeah, you know what was interesting during the debate, news leaked from White House sources that Biden was sick with a cold. I got to ask, if there was such concern over his overall health going into the debate, why move forward? And if he did want to move forward, why not put that out right before the debate so we knew going into it he might have been a little hoarse?
Yeah, that's a key question right there, Julia. And it's something that we're hearing from Democratic lawmakers up here on Capitol Hill, asking why the campaign did not disclose that close beforehand so folks would be prepared when he came out with that raspy voice and came out on a little bit of a slower foot, so to say, when he walked out to the podium and, started talking. So that is definitely a key question. But I mean, this debate has been planned for about a month now. There's been a lot of anticipation around it, a lot of planning. President Biden himself spending the past few days at Camp David preparing. Maybe the campaign just didn't think that the cold rose to the threshold of needing to cancel the debate or moving it back or dropping out of it, what have you. So he did go along with this. But there's definitely been a lot of chatter about this cold and why the campaign did not disclose it earlier, because then expectations would have been rejiggered a little bit and maybe put a little bit lower, knowing that he was a little under the weather, and people wouldn't have been so surprised to hear his hoarse voice when he came out on stage.
A CNN flash poll taken right after the debate shows 67% view Trump as winning the debate. Now, Biden, this is just a small sample of the population, not the entire voting population. And this was just those who watched the debate in real time. So we don't know how much of a correlation there will be between these numbers and data to, real major post-debate polls. But what can we expect from the Biden campaign to shift last night's narrative? I mean, we know that news cycles move pretty quickly now, but we also know that the Biden campaign does not like these stories that question the president's health and mental agility.
I think that's something that we may hear is them trying to flip the switch and put the spotlight on former President Trump. Look, today I've heard from a lot of House Democrats who have said, sure, Biden's performance wasn't great, but on the other hand, former President Trump kept lying, was attacking President Biden. He wouldn't commit to, he only said he would commit to accepting the election results if it was a fair election. He spoke about January 6th. There were a lot of things that Biden said that concerned Democrats. So I think that we're going to likely try to hear Democrats, they know they're not going to get away from having to talk about the debate. I feel like that's a given at this point. So when they ask about it, expect to try to hear them try to pivot to talking about former President Trump's performance and some of the claims he made and the truths he said on stage, because that's been a true concern among lawmakers and also Democratic voters nationwide. So I expect them to really lean into that aspect of last night's debate.
Yeah, we even heard that talking point echoed by First Lady Jill Biden herself in public appearances since the debate. Now, President Biden did hit out on Trump over his felony conviction and even brought up his alleged relationship with adult film star Stormy Daniels. Take a listen.
The only person on this stage is a convicted felon is the man I'm looking at right now.
But when he talks about a convicted felon, his son is a convicted felon.
The crimes that you are still charged with, and think of all the civil penalties you have. How many billions of dollars do you owe in civil penalties for molesting a woman in public, for doing a whole range of things, of having sex with a porn star on the night while your wife was pregnant? I mean, what are you talking about? You have the morals of an alley cat.
I didn't have sex with a porn star. His son is convicted, going to be convicted probably numerous other times.
You know, Michael, in my career in journalism, I never think we'd be talking about presidents, a former president and a current president debating whether one had sex with a porn star during a presidential debate. But here we are, and moving forward, many feel that Biden could have pushed Trump even more on those issues, including his legal challenges. But Trump was very quick to hit back over Hunter Biden's laptop scandal and his felony gun conviction, something that a lot of Democrats and Republicans predicted would happen if Biden went there with Trump. You know, was President Biden able to seize on Trump's legal challenges, or was this seen as an effort that really fell flat?
I mean, I think that he still did, achieve one of his goals in the sense of labeling the former president as a convicted felon, saying he is the only convicted felon up there. Sure, former President Trump came back and said, well, your son is also a convicted felon, but, the son is not running for president. The son is a private citizen. But the fact of the matter is, one of the men up there, of the two men up there, is a convicted felon. That is former President Donald Trump, and that is something that President Biden pointed out. Look, we're still trying to figure out sort of how this conviction is going to play into the election, though there have been some polls that said that some independents and maybe independent-leaning Republicans are a bit weary of the conviction. So perhaps former President Biden was trying to be to that contingent of the electorate. But I know myself, I was a bit surprised that the conviction wasn't discussed more, right? This was such a seismic thing that happened in this debate, this election cycle. I expected it to be discussed more, but nonetheless, there was a lot of policy talk last night. A lot of different topics were hit, so not that much conviction talk. We'll just have to see how it pans out in the days to come.
Well, speaking of some of that policies talk, we know that foreign policy was also front and center during this debate, the war in Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas war in particular. The former president had this to say about President Biden.
As far as Israel and Hamas, Israel's the one that wants to go. He said the only one who wants to keep going is Hamas. Actually, Israel is the one, and you should let him go and let him finish the job. He doesn't want to do it. He's become like a Palestinian, but they don't like him because he's a very bad Palestinian. He's a weak one.
I've never heard so much foolishness.
You know, Michael, President Trump's comments there were pretty ironic because although there are some differences in Trump and Biden's policies on Israel, Biden has been seen as an arguably very pro-Israel president. His party is just divided on the issue. Do you think Biden was able to fight back against those comments from Trump, or is this yet another instance that Trump was able to go on the attack without any pushback from Biden?
Yeah, this is former President Trump trying to exploit the divide within the Democratic Party that's been sizzling in the party for months now, for even years, but have really come out in the open since the October 7th, Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel. And that's the fact that pro-Israel Democrats in the Democratic Party are up against pro-Palestinian liberals who are really incensed at the mounting number of humanitarian deaths in the Gaza Strip. And we've seen these two factions within the Democratic Party be at odds again since October 7th. And it's really become more pronounced as we've had discussions about hostages and ceasefires and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu coming to town next month. So right then and there, President Biden has had a very pro-Israel track record, but former President Trump was trying to exploit those divisions within the Democratic Party and try to tie Biden to some of those more progressive liberals whether or not it was successful, we'll have to see in polls and commentary in time to come. But the Israel-Hamas war has been a really difficult vulnerability for President Biden. We've seen that for months now. Former President Trump was using that to his advantage.
Absolutely. The Democratic Party very much divided over that issue. So moving from foreign policy to sports on the debate stage, at one point, Biden and Trump sparred over golf and who could drive a ball farther.
Just won 2 club championships, not even senior, 2 regular club championships. To do that, you have to be quite smart and you have to be able to hit the ball a long way. And I do it. He doesn't do it. He can't hit a ball 50 yards. He challenged me to a golf match. He can't hit a ball 50 yards.
Look, I'd be happy to have a driving contest with him. The reason I got my handicap, which when I was vice president, down to a 6. But by the way, I told you before, I'm happy to play golf if you carry your own bag. Think you can do it?
What's the biggest rival? He's a 6 handicap of all.
I was an 8 handicap.
Yeah.
8.
Yeah.
But I have, how many?
I've seen you swing. I know you swing.
So Michael, we know that presidents, a lot of recent presidents, like to play golf. There's a very famous video clip of George W. Bush telling the press back to watch him drive the ball back from the 2000s. But look, this is on a debate stage. These are two candidates who aren't seen as very attractive to a large number of voters. How did viewers react to these two bickering over something that, let's be quite frank here, makes absolutely no difference in being president and the performance of being president? Was this seen as out of touch or just, quite frankly, stupid?
It's a good question there, Julia. Look, I haven't really honed in on this part of the debate. I've been trying to focus more on the policy and more on the fallout. So I haven't seen too much voter and viewer response to the golf debate. But I mean, it definitely, there are two wars raging around the globe. There are concerns about the economy, about immigration, about inflation. There's abortion rights and women's reproductive rights that are at the Supreme Court and under attack right now in states across the country. That's a large concern for Democrats. So is it possible that some voters thought it was out of touch? Absolutely. Is it possible that that's not what some voters wanted to hear in their precious hour and a half of debate time? It's definitely a possibility, though. Maybe some folks were kind of interested in seeing a more humanity side of the President Biden and former President Trump, hearing them talk about golf, maybe becoming a little relatable. I'm not sure. I don't know what my handicap is. I had to call my dad later and ask what a golf handicap is, despite being somebody who enjoys playing sometimes and watching golf. So I think that it probably depends on what part of the audience was watching at that point and who it was when you ask what they thought of that little back and forth about golf.
Yeah, maybe we can file this away in political satire in that folder of the debate. Moving back to policy, Trump used last night's debate to continue to spread false information about immigration and border security.
He decided to open up our border, open up our country to people that are from prisons, people that are from mental institutions, insane asylum, terrorists. We have the largest number of terrorists coming into our country right now, all terrorists, all over the world, not just in South America, all over the world. They come from the Middle East, everywhere, all over the world they're pouring in.
So we know that after the debate, there were CNN reporters fact-checking on air former President Trump's claims and also fact-checking President Biden. But why didn't the moderators not fact-check in real time on these comments?
Yeah, well, this was something that the CNN had defended itself of afterwards, saying that, they wanted former President Trump and President Biden to be able to have this debate and that they would have their moderator sit back and not do things like fact check because they want them to be able to have just the two candidates be able to have this intervention and have this conversation. I will let you know, Julia, that I've heard from some House Democrats today saying that they were not happy that former President Trump was not fact-checked throughout the debate. That was a concern among some. Nonetheless, CNN defending itself and its rules right there. So, we'll have to see if there are perhaps any changes for the second debate, if that ends up happening, which is in September. But definitely some criticism about that lack of fact-checking.
So we know that Vice President Kamala Harris was front and center after the debate, making the rounds on all of the major news networks. And she sat down with CNN's Anderson Cooper, who pressed her on Biden's overall performance. She admitted that the president, had a slow start, but ultimately had a strong finish, and defended her, her boss. But many don't you think, would disagree with that, right? I've heard the slow start, strong finish argument, but was it really a strong finish?
I again, think that's going to have to depend on who you ask, right? The first 20, 30 minutes, a lot of folks have said were pretty rough for the president. And then he sort of picked it up a little bit, got a little bit more comfortable in the middle and towards the end. But in terms of the trajectory of how the night went, it's going to be, it's a subjective answer. It's going to depend on who you ask. And that's sort of what this post-debate landscape is all about, that the candidates debate and then everyone else debates about who won and what the highlights were and the takeaways were and the most memorable moments were. So I think that is just part of that post-debate discussion that we see play out all the time.
Congressman Chip Roy announced plans to put forth a resolution urging Vice President Harris to remove Biden under the 25th Amendment. And earlier, Speaker Mike Johnson had this to say about using that amendment.
If I were in a cabinet, in the Biden administration right now, in a cabinet, I would be having that discussion with my colleagues at the cabinet level. I would. And I think many of them, in their heart of hearts, they understand exactly what we do. They see exactly what we do. And we'll see what action they take.
Michael, was this just political posturing from two Republican members of Congress, including the Speaker?
I mean, it could be political posturing, but it is entirely possible that we see a vote on this down the road. Chip Roy officially filed that resolution today. It essentially calls on Vice President Kamala Harris to convene the cabinet and have a conversation about whether or not President Biden is fit to carry out the duties of the office of the presidency. Look, whether or not this gains traction, other Republicans hop on board, that all remains to be seen. I mean, this is something that just broke this morning and is still developing right now. But, nonetheless, the Speaker of the House endorsing something and saying that something should be looked at, that gives it a lot of political heft up here. Will Johnson put it on the floor? Remains to be seen. Will Chip Roy force a vote on it? Remains to be seen. But the fact that it's in the ether is just not something that the Biden campaign and the White House wants to have being discussed.
So during last night's debate, which was obviously the main show of the evening, we know that independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. held his own debate, and he was on The Hill's Rising earlier this morning. Here's what he had to say.
I have the greatest favorability rating of Trump and President Trump and President Biden. That means people would prefer to vote for me, but they're not going to vote for me, many of those Trump and Biden supporters, because they're scared that the other guy will then win. So they're voting out of fear. If I get elected, everything's going to change. Everything's going to change. And if people want that, if people want their America back, they should vote for me.
So Kennedy's still polling at 10%. That's not insignificant, but it's not necessarily major either. Do you think he was able to build any momentum with this, or were most eyes on Trump and Biden?
I mean, it's a big wild card because the thing is that the concerns that folks have had about President Biden have sort of been floating around for a while in terms of his age, in terms of his mental acuity, and his fitness for office. Of course, last night's debate performance just sort of added some credence to that. But I'm curious. I don't know the answer to that. I'm curious to see if some of those voters, maybe if they were a little concerned about Biden before, but this put them over the edge, if they decide to move to RFK Jr., if they decide to just stay home altogether. I'll tell you this, Julia, we've seen in basically all the surveys, both the national polls and the down ballot, both the national polls and the battleground surveys that say that this race is just so close between President Biden and former President Trump, which means that any contingency of the electorate that decides to leave either of those men, either to stay home, to go to the other side, or to go to RFK Jr., could make a big impact when you talk about who is president come November. So when things are this close and when the stakes are this high, anything can change the state of the game. So absolutely something to keep an eye on. Does RFK Jr. have a path to the White House? No. The U.S. political system is a very difficult system for third-party candidates, historically speaking. Again, RFK Jr., you mentioned, just polling at 10%, but could it damage Biden or Trump's campaign? Absolutely. So it's for sure something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, anything can change at this point in the campaign because we're only 5 months from Election Day. So, gosh, we have so much more to watch, Michael. Michael, as always, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Julia.
And you can watch the full interview with RFK Jr. on The Hill's YouTube channel. A Supreme Court ruling today limits obstruction charges against January 6 rioters, a major blow to Jack Smith, who is pursuing the same charge against former President Trump. And the justices also took a sledgehammer to the power of the executive branch agencies. Plus, the court sided with an Oregon city to allow ticketing for homeless individuals camping. Joining me now is the Hill's courts and legal reporter, Zach Schoenfeld. Zach, thank you so much for being here with me today. The court just ruled that an obstruction law used to charge insurrectionists and former President Trump for January 6th was improperly applied. What more can you tell us about that decision, and what does this mean for the DOJ's prosecution of the Capitol attack?
Yeah, Julia, this is a big loss for the Justice Department in its prosecution of the January 6th Capitol attack. They have brought charges against more than 1,000 individuals, and of those, more than 300 face the charge that was at issue before the Supreme Court in the case decided today. So now it throws all of their cases up into the air. I think there's going to be a lot of activity in the coming weeks and about rioters trying to get new trials, maybe some of them who are in jail trying to get released. In fact, we've already seen dockets new filings start to fly in after today's ruling. So a lot of big impacts. It also also could have impact on some of Donald Trump's charges. 2 of his 4 charges in his D.C. case could be impacted by this decision. So a big case. And also, I just want to point out, it was a really interesting lineup on the court today. It was 6-3, but not exactly the normal ideological lines that we're used to seeing. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is President Biden's appointee on the court, joined the conservatives in the majority. She is someone who has ruled for criminal defendants in many contexts, and today those defendants were January 6th rioters.
The court also handed down a decision to overturn the Chevron deference, which will significantly weaken the power of federal agencies to approve regulations. Conservatives have long fought to rein in regulatory authority, so this is a major win for them. How wide-ranging is this ruling, and what regulations will it impact?
This is very wide-ranging. It's pretty hard to understate that. This is going to impact everything from environmental protections to cryptocurrency to consumer protections, you name it. If there is an aspect of American life that is regulated, Chevron likely impacts it. And for the last 40 years, up until today, when lawsuits came into federal courts, if Congress was ambiguous on the issue, then judges had to defer to a federal agency so long as their interpretation was reasonable. Now, today's decision puts judges back in the driver's seat. So this is going to make it a lot easier to challenge federal regulations across the government in areas where Congress hasn't spoken clearly.
Justices also upheld an Oregon city's law which found homeless individuals sleeping outdoors, or fined them, The court did not agree that the law violated the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Will this decision open the door for cities to use the U.S. across the U.S. to impose similar laws?
It does. I think certainly this was top of mind for the justices, not only this ordinance that was at the center of this lawsuit that had made its way up through the courts, this ordinance in Grants Pass, Oregon, but also similar laws that have been enacted by cities and towns across the country. I think if you look both in the written opinion, also while Justice Neil Gorsuch, who wrote today's majority opinion, when he was actually reading it aloud from the bench in the courtroom today, he was taking note of the fact that cities and towns across the country had filed amicus briefs in this case. So I think certainly the justices knew that they were having a ruling here that had nationwide impact. And another thing that underscored that is when we got to the dissent, Justice Sotomayor, she actually read it aloud from the bench, which they reserve for some of their only most high-profile cases. So it only happens a few times a term. So it was really only this Oregon city, but I think the Supreme Court knew that this case mattered a whole lot more.
Zach, before you go, we're still waiting for more decisions from the Supreme Court. What else is in store for the rest of the session?
Well, Chief Justice John Roberts today announced that all remaining opinions will come down on Monday morning. So the Supreme Court has 4 cases left. The headliner is whether former President Trump has criminal immunity. This could impact all 3 of his criminal cases that have not yet gone to trial. So that's the headliner. The other cases, we have 2 big cases involving social media laws, whether laws passed in Texas and Florida by conservatives who said they were being censored that seek to regulate social media platforms, whether those are constitutional. There's also another case impacting government regulations. So 4 more cases, we expect all to come down on Monday morning. Those will start being handed down at 10 a.m. And if I could just plug it, I will say we will have live coverage all morning long on thehill.com.
And we will be following that live coverage, and I encourage our viewers to follow your live blog on that. It'll be an interesting next few weeks. Zach Schoenfeld, The Hill's courts and legal reporter, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.